The rain had arrived late that night in Savannah, splashing quietly on the cobblestone streets as the historic hotel stood calm under amber lights. Claire Madsen walked through the revolving door alone, her heels tapping rhythmically across the lobby floor. The concierge barely noticed her passing as a bellhop unloaded luggage beside him, and the desk clerk argued softly with a guest about late checkout fees. Claire had returned from the welcome dinner hosted by her firm where conversation had been polite. Wine had flowed too freely, and every smile had felt just a shade too practiced. Her badge still hung from her neck, tilted sideways as she waited in front of the elevator with her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup. The camera above the elevator recorded everything. It showed her glancing once at her phone, then stepping inside when the doors opened. At 11:48 p.m., she disappeared into the shaft, the doors closing quietly behind her. No footage ever showed her coming back down, no calls to the front desk, and no motion detected in the stairwell. But her suitcase would be found neatly zipped by the door in her room the next morning, and no one would see her again. Her co-workers had expected her at the 9 a.m. branding session in the conference room. It was just 2 floors below the guest level, but even in a hotel that boasted charm and creaky floors, as part of its personality, Claire's absence stirred concern before lunch. Eli Thompson, who had known her for 3 years and often traded half-smiles during boardroom slideshows, was the first to raise an eyebrow when her seat remained empty. By the time they reached out to her room and got no answer, the hotel had already completed their morning housekeeping rounds. The maid on duty had noted something odd in her log. Claire's bed appeared untouched. The bathroom towels had not been used. Her suitcase stood zipped upright with the handle out like she had packed it early and never intended to sleep. The TV was still on, playing a muted documentary about train stations across the Midwest. The room keycard lay on the nightstand. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no hastily dropped belongings. Just an eerie stillness, the kind that hums at the edges of an unanswered question. The hotel's general manager, an older man with a polished voice and a perfectly knotted tie, reviewed the electronic logs for Claire's keycard. According to their system, she had entered the room once around 5:42 p.m. after the welcome dinner. There were no other entries or exits. Her keycard was never used again. Security footage supported the timeline. Claire had walked in with the group, smiled politely as others made jokes about the charm of the old elevator, then peeled away on her own. The last time any camera captured her was when she stepped into that elevator just before midnight. The hotel had no record of her ever checking out. Her ID phone charger and travel folder with the retreat itinerary remained neatly aligned on the dresser. It was as if the elevator had swallowed her, or she had stepped into a pocket of time that no one else could reach. Police were contacted that afternoon. By dusk, search teams were checking stairwells and emergency exits, unsure of what exactly they were looking for. Savannah was no stranger to haunting stories, whispered legends passed down by bartenders and bellhops. But this felt different. Claire was not the type to vanish. She was meticulous. She had confirmed her attendance 2 weeks prior, flown in early to adjust to the weather, and emailed her supervisor a list of follow-up items she would handle after the conference. Her co-workers remembered her as bright but reserved someone who rarely shared more than necessary, yet was unfailingly reliable. Her absence was louder than a scream. Hotel staff searched again through security logs and were puzzled to find a strange discrepancy. While Claire had used the elevator, the digital log showed that no guest keycard had accessed room 614 during her stay. In fact, when the building supervisor pulled up the maintenance list, room 614 was officially listed as under renovation. Pipes had burst years earlier, and no guests had stayed in it since 2008. But Claire's keycard was labeled 614. Her name had been penciled in by hand on the registration sheet, and the clerk who had checked her in no longer worked at the hotel. The concierge on duty that evening remembered her clearly. She had walked in with the kind of confidence people carry after years of navigating airports and hotels alone. She asked no questions, gave a polite smile, and seemed eager to get to her room. He did not recall anything unusual about her demeanor, except perhaps a certain tiredness that lingered in her eyes. When questioned about the room assignment, he could not recall why he had handed her a key to 614. He had simply followed the note left on his clipboard, one written by the manager earlier that afternoon. But the manager denied writing the note and insisted that room 614 had no bed, no electricity, and no plumbing. Yet Claire had entered a room that night and left her belongings there, and the door had locked behind her like any functioning suite. Rumors began to swirl among the staff. A few of the older employees exchanged glances when the number 614 came up. Someone joked nervously about an urban legend involving a missing guest in the 90s, a woman who had vanished during a company retreat. But there was no police report to confirm that story. No names, no photographs, just a fading memory among aging workers who now avoided certain floors when walking alone at night. The building had changed owners twice since then. Files had been digitized records, compressed or lost. As Claire's parents flew in from the Midwest, local police held a quiet meeting with hotel management. The only thing certain was that Claire Madsen had checked into a room that should not have been assigned. She had entered a working elevator and she had not come back. Whatever happened next would have to be pieced together from incomplete logs, scattered witness memories, and the fragile thread of time that connected her last known actions. That night, while most of the guests slept unaware, Eli stood outside the elevator Claire had used. He stared at the smooth metal doors for several minutes, listening to the hum of the machinery behind them. Then he pressed the call button. When the doors opened, he stepped inside and looked up at the security camera. He felt the familiar sway as the elevator began to rise. Something about that moment felt weightless, as if the truth was just one floor away. But the doors opened to an empty hallway with nothing out of place. He stepped out, unsure of what he had expected. Claire was gone. And so far, the only thing left behind was a trail of quiet impossibilities. The front desk clerk on duty the night Claire checked in was named Daniel Cray. He was 25, quiet, with a habit of chewing his bottom lip when nervous. When detectives asked him about room 614, he appeared genuinely confused. He said he had followed protocol, received her file earlier that afternoon, and keyed in her check-in under her name just like every other guest. But when asked about the printed reservation record, he admitted that hers had appeared strange. Claire's name was listed on the sheet, but the line where the reservation ID should have been was left blank. He said he had assumed the booking had been transferred manually by management and did not want to cause trouble by questioning it. When they showed him the building records confirming that room 614 had been closed since 2008, he paled and kept blinking like someone trying to unsee something. He said he had given her the key himself and remembered clearly that it was labeled 614. The detectives noted his answers, but something in his voice made them unsure whether it was confusion or fear driving his memory. Eli Thompson had not slept much since Claire went missing. He kept replaying their last interaction from the night of the welcome dinner, trying to recall any unusual expression on her face. She had been pleasant, even offered to share a cab with another colleague before deciding to walk. When he returned to the hotel later that night, he noticed Claire standing in the lobby alone, sipping coffee and scrolling on her phone. He remembered the soft whir of the elevator as she stepped inside. It struck him now how calmly she had moved, how ordinary it had seemed. He had thought about calling her name, maybe asking if she wanted company on the way up, but he had not. That choice gnawed at him. The next morning, he joined the hotel's assistant manager to pull printed records for the night. The more he read, the more the entries failed to add up. Claire's booking confirmation was absent from the master log. Her name was typed in by hand on a sheet that no one claimed to have edited. The system marked her stay as canceled the day before she arrived. The hotel's IT technician, a lean man in his 40s named Rob Levine, was called in to examine the internal network. He searched the guest history and found that Claire Madsen had indeed been entered into the database, but only temporarily. The timestamp for her entry into the system showed it was logged at 3:17 p.m. on October 6th and erased 32 minutes later. There was no explanation for this activity. The only trace of her booking was the paper registration card she had signed upon arrival. Rob could not find a digital payment authorization either. Her credit card had not been charged. It was as if someone had planted her name into the check-in process and removed it almost immediately after she received her room key. The staff tried to account for the error, speculating about possible IT glitches, but every theory only deepened the mystery. Claire had checked into a room that officially did not exist for guests using a reservation that was digitally erased within the hour. No other guest reported anything strange that night. When hotel security began interviewing employees off the record, a woman from housekeeping came forward. Her name was Evelyn Rowe. She had worked at the hotel for more than a decade and was familiar with most of the older rooms. She said that room 614 was one of those spaces no one liked to talk about. She had heard that it was damaged after a pipe burst nearly 15 years earlier, but never saw anyone doing repairs. Evelyn claimed the door was always kept locked, and the key was stored in a separate cabinet used for staff-only access. When asked if she had cleaned the room recently, she said no, but added that she remembered seeing a light on behind the door when she passed that hallway on the evening Claire went missing. She said she thought it was strange because maintenance rarely worked that late. She dismissed it at the time, assuming it was none of her business, but now wished she had told someone. Her statement matched the general feeling spreading among staff that something had happened in that room and no one could agree on what it was. The hotel management attempted to control the situation by issuing formal statements about cooperation with law enforcement. They emphasized that the hotel had a long-standing reputation for safety and hospitality, but the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. When officers entered room 614 of the building inspector, they found the space nearly empty. The room contained no furniture, no working outlets, and patches of drywall still exposed. The carpet had been pulled up and replaced with plastic sheeting. The walls bore faint outlines where picture frames once hung, and the smell of dust lingered like an unfinished thought. Yet, there were subtle signs that someone had been there. The door latch had faint scratches near the handle. A used coffee cup with lipstick residue was found in the corner sitting on a folding stool. Most strangely, the light switch worked. The electricity had been restored recently, but no record showed an order for repairs. Eli stood in the middle of the room as the others inspected it, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he knew about Claire. She had never mentioned fear of hotels or expressed discomfort about traveling alone. She was pragmatic and careful. The idea that she had simply vanished from this unfinished room without resistance was difficult to accept. He noticed a faint line of marks near the baseboard as if something had been dragged. When he knelt to examine them, he found a button wedged into the crack, the kind typically sewn onto women's coats. He placed it in a plastic bag and handed it to the detective. It was a small thing, but it felt significant, like the last loose thread in a fabric that had been unraveling for too long. Every detail seemed to confirm one conclusion. Claire had entered room 614. Something had happened inside, and then her presence was scrubbed clean, like a fingerprint wiped from glass. At the police station, the lead detective reviewed the growing stack of reports. He was a methodical man, not easily swayed by stories without evidence. But this case troubled him. He had seen disappearances before, but they always left trails. Phone pings, witness sightings, credit card use surveillance slips. Claire's case offered none of that. Everything she had done that week aligned with routine. Her phone stopped transmitting after 11:49 p.m. Her luggage remained untouched. She had sent an email to her supervisor earlier that evening outlining a Monday follow-up schedule. There were no signs of distress in her messages, but the digital void that followed suggested intentional erasure. Someone had either removed her or ensured she could not be found. And the part that disturbed him most was that her reservation had been canceled from inside the hotel system, and no one could say who had done it. The week following Claire's disappearance passed slowly. The hotel maintained its operations, but conversations among the staff shifted with a tension that could not be concealed. The front desk employees spoke in hushed tones, and the elevator operator refused to cover the 6th floor alone. Hotel security reviewed the footage again, watching Claire step into the elevator one last time. No other guest had entered or exited around the same time, but then a new voice entered the investigation. Luis Moreno, a 20-year-old bellhop who had worked at the hotel for less than 6 months, came forward with an unexpected claim. He said he remembered helping Claire that night. He had carried her suitcase to a room on the 4th floor, not the 6th. When asked to explain, he looked nervous and unsure, but stuck to his story. He recalled her being polite and unusually quiet, with her eyes constantly glancing down the hallway as if watching for someone. He said she asked to go to room 416. That room, according to the registry, was occupied that night by a couple celebrating their anniversary. Luis insisted he remembered correctly, even describing the suitcase color and her coat. Detectives took Luis to the 4th floor and asked him to identify the door. Without hesitation, he pointed to room 416. They checked the registry again and confirmed that Mr. and Mrs. Alton from Charlotte had been the official guests of that room for 2 nights. The Altons were contacted and interviewed. They claimed they had not seen anyone resembling Claire, and denied sharing the hallway with a young woman that evening. Surveillance cameras did not show any footage of Luis assisting her to the 4th floor, nor did they record Claire exiting the elevator on that level. When asked about this inconsistency, Luis became quiet. He said he might have misremembered the floor, but insisted he helped her with her bag. He also said she gave him a $5 bill and asked him not to speak to anyone about her stay. That detail unsettled the investigators. Claire had left no impression of distress before. Yet, if what Luis said was true, she may have feared being noticed, or perhaps had planned to move quietly through the hotel from the beginning. The next step was to re-interview the hotel employees who had worked the night shift. The assistant night manager, Paula Reed, remembered seeing Luis near the lobby stairwell around 9:45 p.m. That contradicted his claim of having helped Claire closer to midnight. Paula said she had dismissed him early because his shift had ended, and he looked pale, like he had seen something that rattled him. She thought he might have been sick, but he refused to speak about it. When detectives confronted Luis with this information, he struggled to answer. After a pause, he admitted he had left early, but returned to the hotel later that evening because he realized he had left his phone charger in the break room. He said that was when he saw Claire again, standing in the lobby. He claimed she asked him to help her discreetly, and he agreed. There were no records of his return, no logged keycard swipes, and no security footage placing him in the building. Still, he held firm to his version of events, though his voice had grown increasingly uncertain. Investigators remained skeptical of Luis's testimony, but one detail kept them from dismissing him entirely. Luis mentioned that Claire had asked him whether room 416 had been recently remodeled. She had said something about the wallpaper looking different than she remembered. The officers were puzzled by that comment, since Claire had never stayed at that hotel before. When they brought it up with her sister during a phone call, she confirmed that Claire had never been to Savannah. She had no known friends or relatives in the city. That left only 2 possibilities. Either Claire had visited previously under unknown circumstances, or Luis was fabricating the entire conversation. The hotel archives were consulted. No past records showed Claire Madsen as a previous guest, but a closer inspection of room 416 revealed something unusual. Behind the dresser, a strip of wallpaper had been replaced recently. When peeled back slightly, the old layer beneath revealed an ornate pattern with gold detailing and a faded mark etched near the corner. It was the letter M scratched into the plaster, barely visible under years of paint. Eli was called in again to review the room. He did not recognize the pattern or the mark, but agreed to return later with a printed photograph from Claire's apartment. Back home in Chicago, her bedroom had similar wallpaper behind her bed. The pattern was nearly identical to the one found beneath the layer in room 416. Eli admitted it could be a coincidence, but it added weight to Louise's claim. If Claire had entered that room, how had she done it without alerting the guests staying there? The Altons maintained they heard nothing unusual that night. No knock on their door. No sound of someone else entering. But the cleaning crew mentioned something small. On the morning of October 7th, when they cleaned room 416, they had found the bathroom sink lightly dripping and a towel with smudges of lipstick even though Mrs. Alton did not wear makeup. The housekeeper had thrown it away thinking it belonged to a previous guest or had been a mistake in rotation. Now, they retrieved the trash records, but the item had already been discarded beyond recovery. As the investigation deepened, Luis became more hesitant in his recollections. He said Claire had seemed anxious but not afraid. She had mentioned meeting someone. He did not know who. He said he noticed a silver bracelet on her left wrist with a single word engraved into the metal. It was the word still. When detectives asked Claire's family if that detail sounded familiar, her sister confirmed that Claire often wore a silver bracelet that had been given to her after their mother passed away. It was a personal item with significant emotional weight. That bracelet had not been recovered from her belongings left in room 614. Its absence now mattered more. Luis had described it without prompting, which suggested he had seen her closely. Whether his timeline was true or distorted by fear or guilt remained uncertain, but his memory of her appearance had matched facts not yet made public. That shifted attention from questioning his motives to wondering if Claire had deliberately chosen to interact with him for reasons she never explained. While the investigation team began revisiting earlier assumptions, they requested access to internal radio communication logs between staff members. The hotel's internal radios were recorded and archived for 30 days. On October 6th at 10:12 p.m., a short transmission from a maintenance technician was logged. The voice stated that he had been called to check flickering lights near the fourth-floor service hallway. When questioned, the technician said he remembered the event and mentioned hearing someone call his name from down the corridor, but he had assumed it was another staff member. He found no electrical issues but admitted that he left the area quickly because he felt something was off. That area of the fourth floor ran adjacent to room 416. Combined with Luis's claim, this detail suggested activity around Claire's potential presence in the area during the hours before her disappearance. It also introduced new speculation. If she had entered that room, she had not done it accidentally. Eli Thompson sat at the dining table in Claire's apartment in Chicago, surrounded by her notebooks on used return flight documents and the framed photo of her and her sister from 3 summers ago. He had offered to help her family sort through her personal things, although most drawers remained untouched out of quiet respect. Claire's absence had begun to feel permanent, but it had not grown any easier to accept. That morning, while sifting through unopened mail on the kitchen counter, Claire's father entered the room holding a postcard. He looked pale, as if the air had been pulled from his lungs. The card had no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Claire's. Her neat cursive trailed across the card in blue ink addressed simply to Mom and Dad. The message was brief and strange. It read, "Do not believe what they tell you. I am okay." The postmark was from New Orleans, dated 4 days after her disappearance. The family had never known Claire to visit Louisiana, and the postcard's content immediately unsettled everyone. Eli called the local investigator in Savannah and emailed a scanned copy of the postcard. Within hours, the police contacted the postal office that handled New Orleans dispatches. Investigators traced the barcode to a self-service kiosk located in a train station terminal. Surveillance footage was limited, as the camera above the kiosk had suffered technical failure that same week. But one angle partially covered a nearby hallway, and from it they were able to extract a 10-second clip. The footage showed a woman in a hooded jacket standing at the kiosk, her back mostly to the camera. The quality was grainy, and her face was never visible. Still, her height and posture resembled Claire. She moved with a sense of purpose, glancing once over her shoulder before slipping the card into the machine. The timestamp confirmed it was recorded on October 10th, 4 days after Claire had vanished. If it was her, it meant she had not only left the hotel but had traveled hundreds of miles undetected. Claire's phone had remained inactive since the night of her disappearance, and her bank account showed no activity. The idea that she could have traveled to New Orleans under her own power raised more questions than it answered. Investigators reviewed the possibility of her boarding a train or a long-distance bus, but all tickets sold during that period required identification. No passenger logs listed her name. One officer proposed that someone else had sent the postcard to create confusion or mislead the investigation, but Claire's family remained convinced that the handwriting was hers. Her sister produced a greeting card from earlier that year, and a handwriting analyst later confirmed with high probability that both were written by the same hand. The content of the message was vague but deliberate. It did not indicate distress, but it also offered no explanation. Most telling was the phrase, "Do not believe what they tell you." It implied that Claire expected misinformation to circulate, and she was attempting to correct the record in her own voice. The police in New Orleans canvassed the train terminal area and questioned nearby vendors. One station clerk remembered a woman matching Claire's description buying a bottle of water and a newspaper. She had spoken little, paid in cash, and wore sunglasses despite being indoors. He remembered her because she had asked for directions to a local park but changed her mind and walked away mid-sentence. No one saw which direction she went. The police collected security camera footage from nearby streets, but no images definitively showed Claire. A broader check for hospital admissions shelter check-ins or ID list bookings in the area yielded no results. If she had remained in New Orleans, after mailing the postcard she had left no further trace. That absence suggested either a calculated effort to disappear or the help of someone who knew how to conceal movement. Her sister mentioned that Claire had always preferred cash over cards when traveling, a habit picked up from their cautious mother. But even that detail did not explain how she had managed to cross state lines without alerting anyone. Eli began reviewing Claire's email history again. He had access to her laptop, and with permission from her parents, he combed through folders and inboxes for anything that might explain her actions. One thread stood out. A few weeks before her trip, Claire had received an email from someone named Ellen B. The message was short and cryptic. It said, "I think I found it. Same place as last time. Room 4-something." Claire had replied with a simple question. "Are you sure?" There was no further correspondence. Investigators attempted to trace the email account but found that it was registered under a false name and routed through a foreign server. The sender had covered their tracks well. The phrase "same place as last time" caught their attention. Claire had no record of previous visits to Savannah, but perhaps she had been there under circumstances she had not shared with anyone. If Ellen B. had been real and had knowledge of room 416 or a previous visit, then Claire's presence at that hotel may not have been random. Detectives spoke again with the Altons, the couple who had stayed in room 416 the night Claire went missing. This time they were asked about their check-in experience and whether they had noticed anything unusual in their room. Mrs. Alton hesitated before answering. She said she had noticed a faint scent of perfume near the closet, which had not been used by either of them. She had also found a single earring on the floor beneath the nightstand, but assumed it had been left by a guest before them. She placed it in the trash and thought nothing more of it. When asked to describe it, she said it was a small silver hoop. Claire's sister later confirmed that Claire often wore silver hoops and that one had gone missing from the set found in her suitcase. Investigators returned to the hotel waste disposal records, but several days had passed and the trash had been collected and removed. The physical evidence was lost, but the implication lingered. Claire had likely entered room 416, and she may have done so without the knowledge of the occupants. Detectives reviewed internal elevator logs once more. Between 10:55 p.m. and 11:01 p.m. on the night Claire disappeared, the elevator registered a stop at the 4th floor, unaccounted for by any guest keycard swipes. The timing placed it roughly 30 minutes before her final known appearance on camera entering the elevator to go to the 6th floor. That 6-minute window became critical. If Claire had accessed the 4th floor and interacted with someone or something there, then returned to the lobby and later took the elevator again, it could explain her odd behavior as observed by Luis. Investigators continued to build a timeline. Claire had gone to room 416 earlier that night, possibly met someone there, and later returned to her assigned room or another part of the hotel. Then something had caused her to vanish. Whether she left on her own or under duress remained unclear, but the postcard proved she had survived at least several days after disappearing from the hotel. The hallway on the 6th floor, where room 614 sat, remained quiet in the days after Claire's disappearance. The door stayed locked, and the room remained untouched by staff while investigators examined the area. Building maintenance reported that room 614 had long served as a makeshift storage space for old linens, spare furniture parts, and unused lighting fixtures. When the police requested access to the adjacent supply closet to look for clues, the head of engineering met them with a ring of old keys and a worn clipboard. The closet sat directly across from room 614, behind a faded wooden door with peeling white paint. Inside, the air felt stale, and the lighting flickered once before settling into a low hum. The room was cluttered, but not overwhelming. Metal shelves lined one wall filled with labeled boxes and bins of unused inventory. In the far corner, behind a broken chair and 2 cracked light fixtures, one officer noticed something tucked under a dusty sheet. When he lifted the fabric, it revealed a full-length mirror, old, and framed in dark wood, its edges chipped and covered in streaks. At first, the mirror seemed unremarkable. The glass was fogged, and its reflection dimmed by time and dust. The officer stepped forward gently, wiped the center with his sleeve, and paused. Near the upper right corner, etched into the glass with what looked like a sharp metal point, were 3 letters. They read CMH. When shown to Claire's sister later that day, she confirmed that those were Claire's full initials, Claire Marie Hale. The discovery was unsettling. The mirror had not been in use or on display for years. Staff had no record of it being moved recently, and it was not listed in the hotel's updated inventory. The engineering supervisor claimed that the mirror had been stored there since before his time, and he had worked there since 2009. The timing made little sense. If Claire had only arrived days ago, how could her initials be carved into an object that had not seen daylight for over a decade? Investigators sent the mirror to forensics for closer inspection, hoping to match the carving with a known sample of Claire's handwriting, or at least determine how fresh the scratches were. Later that afternoon, Eli walked through the 6th floor hallway once more. The light fixture above room 614 buzzed faintly. He stood outside the door for a long time before finally moving down the corridor to examine the storage closet himself. He stepped inside, ducking beneath low-hanging wires and inhaling the faint smell of mildew. He stood in front of the mirror, seeing his reflection blur slightly in the dusty glass. There was something eerie about the room, not in a supernatural way, but in the uncomfortable weight of memory pressing down. As he turned to leave, he noticed something that had not been mentioned in the report. Near the mirror's base below the etching was a tiny smear of what looked like dried lipstick. It was the same muted rose shade Claire had worn at the welcome dinner, a color she had described once as simple and adult. Eli pointed it out to the officer escorting him. A swab was taken and sent for analysis. The smudge was small, nearly invisible, but it offered one more detail to chase. If it matched Claire's lipstick, it meant she had been in that closet and she had been close enough to touch the mirror. Forensics later confirmed that the etching had been made within the past 5 days based on residue found inside the grooves. The pressure applied was consistent with a metal object such as a key or the edge of a nail file. The lipstick sample was too degraded for full confirmation, but chemical traces matched the brand and shade found in Claire's travel case. The implications grew heavier. Claire had somehow accessed the storage closet after her check-in, possibly after entering room 614. She had written her initials and left a mark that only a thorough search would uncover. If she had done it willingly, it might have been a way of signaling her presence. If it had been done under duress, it became something far more chilling. Investigators began reviewing maintenance logs for any entries involving the 6th floor in the 48 hours after Claire's arrival. They found a single mention. A request had been filed on October 6th for a check on the hallway thermostat. The technician assigned to the task reported no issues, but the entry included a note stating that the closet across from room 614 had been ajar. The maintenance technician was brought in for questioning. His name was Russell Keyes, and he had worked for the hotel for nearly 6 years. He said the service request came through a standard internal system and that he had responded around noon on October 6th. He remembered the thermostat was fine, but he found it strange that the closet door was open with no one nearby. He claimed he looked inside briefly and saw nothing unusual. He had not noticed the mirror or any evidence of recent activity. When asked if he had seen anyone on that floor during his visit, he hesitated. Then he said he remembered passing a woman near the stairwell. She wore a long coat and had her hair tied up, looking down at something in her hands. He said she did not speak, and he assumed she was a guest. When shown a photo of Claire, he said it could have been her but could not confirm with certainty. The hallway camera near the stairwell had not recorded any activity at that time. It had been marked as inactive due to a firmware update. At that point in the investigation, detectives considered another possibility. Perhaps Claire had never intended to sleep in her assigned room. Perhaps her actual destination had always been the 6th floor, and the room assignment was only a step in a broader plan. But the existence of the mirror and the initials challenged that theory. If she had known about the storage room in advance, how had she learned about it? And why would she choose to leave a nearly invisible message there? If she had discovered it unexpectedly, it raised another question. What exactly was she doing on the 6th floor, exploring areas not meant for guests? Then came another detail. The building's original blueprints retrieved from city archives showed that room 614 had once been larger and connected by a pass-through door to the storage closet. That door had been sealed off during renovations, but a faint outline remained beneath the wallpaper inside room 614. It was not visible from the closet side, but it meant that the two spaces had once been connected. Claire might have found a way from one room to the other, especially if she had been searching or following someone's directions. Eli returned to the hotel late that evening and met with Naomi Hicks, a local journalist who had taken interest in the case. She had been covering the story quietly, gathering off-the-record comments from staff and old records from the city archive. She mentioned something he had not heard before. In 1993, a woman named Chloe Mathers had gone missing during a business trip at the same hotel. She had stayed on the 6th floor. Her case had never been solved. No clear evidence had been found, and her room assignment had been lost when the hotel transitioned to digital files in 1999. Naomi had discovered her name in a guest log stored on microfilm. The last entry next to her name listed room 614. When Eli heard this, the connection hit hard. Two women, nearly 2 decades apart, both tied to a room that no longer officially existed. Claire had carved her initials into a mirror left in a closet that few had entered in years. The timing, the location, and the secrecy all pointed to something that had been hidden deliberately. Naomi Hicks returned to her downtown apartment late that night with her bag full of scanned newspaper clippings and old registry records. The discovery of Chloe Mathers' name in the hotel guest log from 1993 had altered her understanding of the case. She had originally followed Claire's disappearance as a journalist interested in local crime, but had since grown invested beyond her professional obligations. Naomi sat down at her kitchen table and pulled out the microfilm she had copied at the Savannah Public Library. She scrolled through the archived guest registries from October 1993 and circled the line that included the entry for Chloe Mathers. Room 614 had been printed neatly beside her name. Her check-in date was October 4th. Her checkout date remained blank. The police report from that time had been short and vague. Chloe was last seen leaving a conference dinner alone and wearing a green shawl. She had told another guest that she felt lightheaded and wanted to return to her room. No witnesses recalled seeing her after that moment. Her luggage was never found. Her room had appeared undisturbed. Her name vanished from local headlines within a week. Naomi reached out to the Savannah Police Department to request access to archived records on the 1993 case. She was directed to a back-office storage facility where dusty boxes lined the walls, some unopened for years. A clerk handed her a manila folder labeled with a faint M and a partial date. Inside were 3 photos, a missing persons form, and an incident summary. The file mentioned that Chloe had worked in publishing and was attending a regional conference on women in media. The report mentioned her room assignment, though it had been partially redacted. What stood out to Naomi was a handwritten note paper-clipped to the back of the file. It said, "Possible maintenance access door between guest room and linen closet. Old blueprint attached." No blueprint remained. The hotel staff at the time had apparently raised concerns about unauthorized access between service spaces and guest rooms, especially on the 6th floor. Naomi took a photo of the note and added it to her digital file on Claire's case. She suspected the original blueprint would match the one investigators had found days earlier. Later that week, Eli met Naomi in a coffee shop near the Riverwalk. He looked worn from lack of sleep and had started carrying Claire's bracelet in his coat pocket as a quiet reminder. Naomi showed him the photos of Chloe Mathers. Claire and Chloe had no family connection, but their physical appearance shared uncanny similarities. Both were in their early 30s, with dark hair and narrow features. Both had attended conferences and vanished within a day of arrival. Naomi then showed Eli a column written by Chloe 2 months before her disappearance. It described her discomfort with corporate retreats and hinted at an anxiety she could not name. One line stood out. She had written, "There are places that were not meant for guests, and I have walked into one." Naomi believed Chloe may have had a private reason for visiting room 614. Perhaps she was investigating something herself, or had received information just like Claire might have. The similarities became more difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Detectives resumed interviews with long-term hotel staff, focusing on anyone employed during both time periods. One name surfaced repeatedly. Gerald Langston had been the head of facilities from 1989 to 2011. He had retired shortly before Claire's disappearance, but was still living in Savannah. Officers visited him at his small house on the outskirts of town. Gerald was in his late 70s and reluctant to speak at first. He insisted he remembered little from his final years at the hotel. But when shown the guest logs and blueprints, he began to open up. He said there had been rumors about room 614, especially after 1993. Staff called it the room with a memory. He explained that after Chloe's case faded from the public eye, management decided to seal the old pass-through and reassign the storage area for inventory. He admitted that some objects from the room had been moved without records. The mirror, he said, had once hung inside room 614 before it was removed during cosmetic renovations in the late 90s. He said it always gave him an odd feeling. One detail Gerald provided caught the lead detective's attention. He said that before the pass-through was sealed, there had been reports from cleaning staff of hearing voices in the storage closet. Not ghost stories, just murmurs that sounded like conversations ending abruptly when the door opened. He said the walls between the rooms were thin, and the pass-through was covered only by a sliding panel. After Chloe's disappearance, he personally secured the door from the storage side, nailing it shut before it was eventually sealed with drywall. He said he thought management had ordered it closed to prevent insurance concerns. When asked whether he ever thought about reopening it, he said no. He had never gone back into the storage closet once it was sealed. He said people at the hotel had short memories, but buildings never forgot. His words stayed with the team longer than they expected. Naomi dug further into Chloe's past and found that her sister Diane Mathers was still alive and living in Asheville. Naomi reached out and arranged a phone interview. Diane spoke cautiously at first, but became more open when she learned Claire had disappeared under similar circumstances. She confirmed that Chloe had been secretive in her final months and had spoken vaguely about looking into something at one of her conferences. Diane did not know what Chloe had meant, but remembered that she had once used the phrase, "Not every room is for everyone." When Naomi asked whether Chloe had ever mentioned Savannah before her trip, Diane said yes. She had visited once as a teenager on a school field trip and had written in her journal that the hotel had made her uneasy. That line, though small, struck Naomi as another thread in a much older fabric. It seemed Chloe may have returned to the same building later in life and may have already sensed something hidden there long before she became a guest. Back in Chicago, Claire's sister found one of Claire's older travel journals from her college years. Tucked inside the back page was a folded flyer for a regional writing competition held in Savannah in 2010. Claire had attended as a student. Her notes on the back included the name of the hotel. This detail had never come up during the investigation. It appeared Claire had visited the building before years earlier. Her entry on the last page read simply 6th floor, was colder than the others. No mention of people or events, just a feeling. Her family had assumed the conference was uneventful. Now they wondered whether Claire had returned with unfinished thoughts or with lingering questions she had never spoken aloud. The past began to echo more clearly. Eli met Naomi again in the hotel lobby just after noon. She had brought with her an envelope containing additional printouts records from Chloe Mather's publishing archives and copies of floor schematics from 1993 and 2023. The two sat in the corner of the lobby cafe away from the noise of tourists asking about ghost tours. Naomi placed one sheet in front of Eli, an overlay showing the 6th floor as it once was and as it existed now. The most noticeable difference lay between room 614 and the service closet. In the older version, there was a thin line indicating a removable panel labeled as linen pass-through. The modern layout had no such detail, and the closet was now walled off on the hotel's internal maps. Naomi had confirmed with the contractor that such changes often went undocumented when deemed minor or cosmetic. Her contact said that hotels sometimes made adjustments without permits, especially when the modifications did not affect weight-bearing walls. That explained why no official file listed the 6th floor renovations after 1993. She believed Claire might have accessed the hidden panel or seen signs of it being reopened. The blueprints gave them reason to look more closely. They returned to the 6th floor with the permission from management. 2 officers accompanied them. While the closet had already been searched for immediate clues, no one had examined the wall behind the metal shelf nearest to room 614. Eli and Naomi moved the shelf aside with help from maintenance. Dust swirled in the air as the legs scraped against the concrete floor. Behind it, the drywall had been patched unevenly. A narrow seam ran horizontally across the center of the wall, barely visible unless viewed up close. Naomi used her flashlight to inspect the surface. Her knuckles tapped lightly, producing a hollow sound. One of the officers removed a utility blade and scored along the seam. The panel cracked open after minimal effort. Inside was a shallow compartment less than 2 feet deep, lined with old insulation. Tucked at the back, barely visible in the gloom, was a sealed plastic bag. The officer retrieved it carefully and handed it to the lead detective. Inside were 3 printed photographs and a small notebook. The air in the room seemed to change. The photographs had curled slightly at the corners from age. They showed the same room from different angles. Room 614 could be identified by the window and wallpaper pattern, but something was different. In one photo, a woman stood near the bed. She was facing away from the camera, her hair pulled into a high bun, her figure narrow. In the second photo, she sat on the edge of the bed holding something in her hands. The final image captured her reflection in the room's wall mirror, though her face had been blurred by motion or poor focus. The woman was not Claire. The timestamp in faded print on the back read October 3rd, 93. Naomi compared it with known images of Chloe Mathers. The posture and hairstyle matched. Eli stared at the photos without speaking. The person who had taken them had done so from the hallway, or perhaps from just inside the closet. Whoever took the photographs had watched her for some time. The notebook found with the images contained just 4 pages of writing. Each page began with a date and a brief paragraph. The first entry, dated October 2, 1993, mentioned an early check-in and an unlisted room assignment. The second described hearing movement behind the closet wall and thinking it was a service staff member. The third was shorter. It read, "This room was not ready. I was not supposed to be here." The final entry, dated the night Chloe disappeared, read, "I see the same pattern again. The gold frames the chair facing the wrong direction. I think I followed someone else's instructions without realizing it. I will leave soon." The notebook ended there. The handwriting matched the known samples from Chloe's journal found years ago. The fact that these items had remained hidden behind a wall panel confirmed that someone had placed them there deliberately. It was not a mistake or forgotten storage. It had been a hiding place for evidence, and no one had returned for it. The compartment had been sealed well enough to stay untouched for nearly 3 decades. Naomi and Eli stood in silence after the officer resealed the bag. No one in the room wanted to say what they were thinking. Later that evening, the lead detective met with hotel security to review footage from the hallway on the 6th floor. While the cameras were newer and fully functional in the present, none had been installed until after the renovation in 2012. There was no video history available from 1993, but a maintenance log from early 2021 had an odd notation. During routine light fixture replacement outside room 614, a staff member reported seeing a wooden trail marker tucked behind a fire extinguisher cabinet. The entry said item removed and stored. When questioned, the facilities director recalled the object. It had been a short piece of wood about a foot long, shaped like an arrow and painted white. The hotel had assumed it was part of a set piece from a wedding held on the top floor weeks earlier. They placed it in storage in the basement and forgot about it. The officers asked for access to the storage archive. Hours later, the item was located. The arrow had no writing, but one side had a faint smudge in red ink. Under closer inspection, it resembled a fingerprint. The item was photographed and taken for analysis. Fingerprint tests showed a partial match to Claire, though not strong enough to be used in legal proceedings. It placed her in contact with the object before her disappearance. Naomi believed Claire had found the marker and followed it. It would explain her detour to room 614 and the storage closet. It might also explain her change in behavior that night. If she believed someone had left her a message or was guiding her to a hidden place, she may have followed it willingly. Her search could have mirrored Chloe's actions from years earlier. Claire had previously visited the hotel in 2010. She may have seen something back then and returned later to find it again. The discovery of the arrow, the sealed notebook, and the photographs painted a clear picture. Someone had led both women toward the same space. Both had documented unease. Both had left fragments of evidence behind. But only one postcard had surfaced, and it had come too late to prevent the descent into uncertainty that followed. 3 days after the trail marker was recovered, Naomi sat in her apartment, cross-referencing her notes from the past 6 weeks. The notebook found behind the wall had mentioned a gold-framed chair positioned incorrectly, a detail that had seemed odd until she reviewed old promotional photos of the hotel from the early 1990s. In one of them, room 614 was shown with a high-backed, gold-framed chair near the window facing inward instead of out toward the view. The placement matched Chloe's journal note exactly. Naomi became convinced that someone had preserved specific details about the room's interior for years, using them to manipulate others who found themselves inside. Her next step was to review Claire's old social media profiles. While most of her content was mundane, one post from 2010 during her college trip to Savannah stood out. It showed a photo of a wooded trail just outside the city. The caption read, "Found the quiet spot." No signs. Just trees and breath. Claire had tagged the location as Black Ridge Preserve, a place unfamiliar to Naomi, but known to hikers as a sparse and underdeveloped reserve located 30 minutes outside town. Eli agreed to drive out with Naomi the next morning. They packed flashlights, bottled water, and copies of the floor plans and photos. When they arrived at the preserve, the parking area was nearly empty. The trails were poorly marked as described in several online reviews. Naomi led the way based on memory and instinct. About a mile in, they found a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. At the edge of the clearing stood a narrow path not listed on any map. The dirt path cut through the brush at a shallow incline with only broken branches and exposed roots as signs that it had been used. They followed it carefully for another quarter-mile until the trail opened into a flat space. There, at the center of the clearing, sat a small wooden cabin no larger than a tool shed. The wood was weathered and pale, the door half-hinged and leaning. One window had been boarded up while the other was covered with a curtain that had faded from green to gray. The area was silent except for the breeze through the leaves. Eli approached the door and pushed it slowly. The interior smelled like damp wood and thyme. Dust coated every surface and the floor creaked with every step. In one corner there was a makeshift table made from 2 stacked crates and a warped board. On top of it sat an old camping lantern, a rusted tin cup, and a small lockbox with no visible keyhole. Naomi scanned the walls. There were remnants of tacked papers corners, ripped glue residue still visible. The back wall had a single nail near eye level. Hanging from it was a laminated page yellowed with age, displaying what looked like a floor plan. It was not the hotel. It was a hand-drawn map of a different structure, one with narrow corridors and multiple rooms connected by short hallways. Each room had a letter instead of a number. One corridor had a red line drawn through it. At the bottom, a note was written in small print. "If you see the chair, do not sit." The handwriting was rushed and narrow, uneven, as if written in fear. Eli opened the drawers of a small wooden cabinet in the corner. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a disposable camera and a compact cassette recorder. The camera was unused, but the recorder had a cassette inside. Naomi turned it over and noted the handwriting on the label. The letters read, C.M. Hale. She'd slipped it into her bag carefully and suggested they take the items back for review. As they were about to leave, Eli noticed a faint mark carved into the cabin's wooden beam near the door. He leaned in closer. The initials were the same ones found on the mirror. CMH. Naomi took a photo and stepped back. The place had not been lived in recently, but someone had used it. It was too deliberate, too preserved, too connected to Claire's story to be unrelated. The structure had no power, no signs of technology, no bed or food supplies. It was not a shelter. It felt more like a waypoint, a place where someone had waited or prepared. Neither of them wanted to stay longer than necessary. Back in town, they met with the detective and handed over the recorder and camera. The cassette was sent to audio technicians for safe playback. The footage from the camera would take longer due to the film development process. 2 days later, the recording was ready. The first 40 seconds were filled with ambient noise, soft wind, and faint shifting. Then a voice began. It was Claire. Her tone was steady but low. She said she did not know who would hear this, but that she believed she'd walk the same path as someone else. She mentioned names and fragments, Chloe being one of them. She said she had followed instructions she could no longer find, and that every door she entered led to silence. Her last sentence before the tape cut off was measured but fragile. I am still here, but not the way I was. Eli listened with his eyes closed, memorizing the cadence of her voice. There was no fear in her tone, only resignation and a thread of sorrow that clung to every word. The detective ordered a second search of the preserve with a forensic team. They returned to the cabin with ground-penetrating radar and scanned the soil around the structure. Nothing was found. No bones, no remains, no personal items other than what had already been recovered. The land had no registry, and ownership records showed that it had once belonged to a timber company that dissolved in 1998. Since then, the area had been under state oversight but remained undeveloped. There was no path on official maps, no access road noted in county documents. Someone had maintained that cabin with effort and intent. The lack of any living trace suggested that whoever used it had done so without leaving behind typical signs. Naomi returned to her notes and marked every time Claire had mentioned quiet spaces, solitude, or absence. They now read differently. They were not poetic or metaphorical. They were instructions. Pieces of a plan she may not have fully understood even as she followed them. The camera film was developed the next day. Most of the images were blank, the result of expired film and poor lighting. But one photo taken from inside the cabin showed a corner of the room with the crate table and lantern. In the reflection of the lantern's metal base, a partial figure appeared. Only a portion of a hand and the side of a face were visible. It was impossible to determine identity, but the presence of another person inside the frame changed the nature of the image. Claire had not been alone when the photo was taken. The reflection belonged to someone else, someone standing nearby. Naomi stared at the photo for a long time and then slid it into her folder. She labeled it the companion. The idea that Claire had help, or at least company, reframed their assumptions. Perhaps she had not vanished. Perhaps she had walked away with someone who had been watching for a long time. Naomi returned to the hotel 2 days after the cabin visit, her mind still unsettled by Claire's voice on the cassette. She carried a notepad filled with scribbled fragments and timelines that no longer seemed linear. She asked to revisit the hotel archives once more, this time with permission to look through internal staff ledgers from the late 1990s through the mid-2000s. The hotel had changed ownership in 2007, and anything prior to that had been boxed up in the sub-basement. An assistant manager led her down a narrow staircase beneath the old laundry room to a small records room lined with metal shelving. The folders were organized by year and department. Naomi pulled the ledgers marked Guest Relations and Housekeeping logs from the years closest to Chloe Mathers's disappearance and began reading through yellowed pages. Most entries were dull reports of missing towels or noise complaints. But one entry from 1995 stood out. A staff member had recorded a guest inquiry about a room not listed on the standard directory. The guest had asked about room A6. The staff response was listed only as noted and resolved internally. The reference to room A6 was unfamiliar. Naomi searched building schematics again and found no such designation. But it reminded her of the hand-drawn map found in the cabin where each room was labeled with a letter instead of a number. The red-lined corridor that appeared on the map intersected room A. She considered the possibility that the cabin's map might have been symbolic or coded, but something about the hotel record made her think otherwise. She continued flipping pages and found an even older entry from 1991 where a guest from Boston had checked out early after requesting to change rooms due to hallway traffic during the night. His complaint mentioned hearing a door open and close repeatedly, even though his room was at the end of the 6th-floor corridor. That door, if real, should not have been there. Naomi photographed the page and emailed it to the lead detective with a note saying hallway anomaly documented. The detective replied with a single sentence, "We need to see the original staff roster from 1993. That afternoon, the hotel's Human Resources Department provided a printed list of all employees who worked during the month of Chloe Mathers's disappearance. Several names had already been interviewed. One, however, had never been located. His name was Owen Brandt, listed as a temporary employee under Facilities Services. His contract lasted only 4 months, ending in November 1993. No contact information was available beyond an old address in rural Georgia. Naomi ran the name through newspaper archives and found nothing. She searched through real estate records and came up with one match. A property sold in 1996 listed him as the former owner. It had been a 2-acre lot with a small structure located just outside the Black Ridge Preserve. She contacted the county recorder and requested any records linked to Owen Brandt. The clerk said that the name matched someone who had filed permits for non-residential construction in 1992, but no structure had ever been formally inspected. Naomi suspected this land might have once held the cabin they had visited. The timeline matched. The location fit. The connection felt too precise to ignore. Meanwhile, Eli continued helping the detective's team digitize Claire's documents. While scanning her old travel notebooks, he found an envelope taped to the back cover of one from 2010. It contained a folded sheet labeled Ledger Code. Inside were several lines of numbers and single letters. At first it resembled a basic encryption, but closer analysis showed it mirrored a hotel room assignment format used before the renovation. Claire had created a cross-reference guide for rooms she believed were mislabeled. She had mapped letters to numbers and noted inconsistencies in the sixth-floor design. One notation read a 6 equal sign 614. That discovery aligned with the 1995 guest complaint Naomi had uncovered. Claire had known about room A6 and had theorized it was the disguised or renamed room 614. The idea that the hotel had reassigned room numbers to obscure previous records began to make sense. Claire had seen a pattern in the way the building had been documented, and she had created a private system to interpret it. Her decision to return years later appeared increasingly deliberate. The detective brought in a consultant familiar with building code transitions and historical preservation. Together, they reviewed the physical layout of the sixth floor and used heat imaging to scan walls for hidden voids. One reading showed a temperature inconsistency near the north wall of room 614. They drilled carefully and discovered a narrow cavity behind the drywall approximately 2 feet wide and 10 feet long. Inside, they found a ledger stored in a canvas pouch. The cover was blank. When opened, the pages revealed handwritten entries dating from 1988 to 1994. Each entry listed room designations, guest names, and symbols no longer used in hotel management. The entries used letters in place of numbers and recorded phrases such as "quiet arrangement honored and no external record." The handwriting was not corporate or standardized. It looked personal. The book appeared to be an unofficial registry, a record kept by someone tracking movement inside the building outside of formal systems. One entry, dated October 5, 1993, included the initials CM and listed A6 with a note stating transition not completed. Another entry from October 4, 2010 showed the initials CH and a room designation that matched Claire's first visit. The handwriting in these later entries appeared more rushed, as though they had been written in a hurry. The final legible entry in the ledger had no date, but listed only the initials CMH and a location marked off-premise. The team interpreted this to mean that Claire had been logged into the ledger likely by someone else, and her last known location had been outside the hotel. Naomi studied the symbols and layout and realized that every few pages had faint crease marks in the same corner as though folded repeatedly to the same page. These folds corresponded with entries that lacked last names. All of them carried notes such as direction given or return uncertain. The phrases disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. The ledger implied an awareness of who came and went beyond any hotel system, and someone had kept that knowledge private for years. As word of the ledger spread among the investigative team, questions surfaced about the possibility of an off-the-books operation within the hotel years earlier. Nothing in the ledger was outright illegal, but the language used suggested intentional concealment. The theory emerged that certain guests were placed in rooms without documentation either by arrangement or at their request. Claire might have uncovered evidence of this during her first visit. Naomi believed she returned to verify the theory and walked directly into the same pattern that had swallowed Chloe Mathers. The ledger had no clear author, but several pages showed signs of being written with different pens and different pressure. This suggested multiple contributors. The detective made a note to have handwriting experts analyze it further. For now, they scanned and stored the original and sealed the cavity. No one wanted to speculate how many other voids might exist inside the building. Eli stood outside the hotel just after sunrise, staring at the sixth-floor windows while the morning fog lifted slowly off the river. He had not gone inside that day, not because he lacked the right, but because the building no longer felt like a place that could offer any answers. It had become a container of fragments, a house of mirrors without reflections. Naomi joined him minutes later, holding a manila folder under her arm and 2 coffees in hand. They had not spoken much in the past 24 hours except to share updates or restate facts. The final report on the ledger had come in the previous night, Handwriting analysts confirmed at least 3 different individuals had contributed to the entries over the span of several years. One of the samples appeared to match the signature found on maintenance requests filed in 1993 by Owen Brandt. The other 2 samples remained unidentified but consistent with the style and ink used on guest forms from the same decade. The final page bearing the initials CMH showed increased pen pressure and uneven lettering signs, often associated with writing done while standing or under stress. Claire's family had been updated privately by the detective. They requested no press statement and declined further interviews. Her parents returned to Chicago without ceremony. Her sister remained behind for a few extra days to collect remaining items and deliver her personal thanks to Naomi and Eli. They spoke gently and briefly. No tears were shed in front of others. The grief was quiet and practiced by then. Claire's mother had said on her last morning in Savannah that she no longer believed her daughter had simply vanished, but rather had followed something she could not explain to anyone in time. She said she forgave her. Naomi kept that moment written on a slip of paper in her wallet. That morning, she handed the manila folder to Eli. Inside was a scanned copy of a letter. It had arrived 2 days earlier at the Savannah Journal's editorial office in an envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the envelope matched Claire's known style. The content of the letter was short and dated in the upper corner. It read only October 6th, followed by the year of her disappearance. There were 5 sentences. I came here to finish a question. I found a place that answered it differently. I walked through spaces that were not marked, but they were meant for me. I remember the people who waited and the silence that came after. I am not missing, I just took the other trail. The postmark had been blurred by moisture. No fingerprints were recoverable. Forensic analysts said the ink and paper were commercially available and offered no forensic distinction. The envelope was standard. The mystery was not in the materials but in the weight of the words. Eli read the letter 3 times before folding it again and sliding it back into the folder. He looked at Naomi and asked if she believed Claire had written it before or after she left the hotel. Naomi said she believed it had been written during the pause between known actions and the last certainty of presence. She said it sounded like a goodbye offered only when someone knows they will not be able to return. They left the hotel property that morning and drove toward Black Ridge Preserve. The path was familiar now and needed no map. They followed the curve of the trail until the trees began to close in and the quiet grew heavier with each step. They reached the clearing where the cabin once stood. The site had been cleared 2 days prior by order of the Forestry Service. The structure had been deemed unsafe and removed for liability reasons. Nothing remained except the outline of its foundation and the indentation in the earth where the crates once rested. Eli stepped forward and stood at the center of the circle, while Naomi remained at the edge watching the light filter through the leaves. He knelt and placed a small stone at the center one he had carried in his pocket for 3 days. It was smooth and light gray with a faint white line running through its center. Claire had once told him during a hike years earlier that she collected stones like that because the line meant they had survived pressure without breaking. They stayed in the clearing for nearly an hour without speaking. When they walked back, Naomi said she had decided not to write the story after all. She said it did not belong on paper. It belonged where it had taken place in the silence between names and numbers and the spaces people pass by without seeing. Eli nodded and said he understood. That night they scanned the last of the cabin items into a secure archive. The camera, the cassette, the trail marker, and the ledger were boxed together in a climate-controlled vault managed by the State Historical Society. No public statement was issued. No press release was circulated. The room that had once been 614 was closed again this time with drywall from floor to ceiling, and no indication it had ever been accessible. Future guests would walk past it without knowing. The hallway lights would flicker as always, the elevator would hum and stop at each floor, the hotel would continue hosting weddings and conferences and weekend travelers unaware of what had once taken place beyond a sealed door. 2 months later, a package arrived at Claire's family home in Chicago. It contained a blank postcard with no stamp and no writing, just an outline of a tree printed in pale green ink. Her sister kept it in a drawer beside the bed and told no one. Some stories were not meant to end cleanly. Some lives curved away from the paths others followed and made their own shapes in the dirt and in memory. Claire Madsen had followed a trail that others had glimpsed but not understood. She had found an intersection of rooms and maps and names that had been rearranged to confuse. She had traced the edge of something kept quiet by time and routine. In the end, she had not left behind a body or a single moment of evidence that proved what happened beyond question. What she left was a pattern, a voice, a set of initials behind glass, and a letter that explained nothing yet closed everything. Eli eventually returned to work. Naomi began researching her next article but never submitted it. Claire's name remained in police databases as unresolved but not actively investigated. The ledger was labeled as a non-criminal artifact and stored as an example of informal record-keeping from the late 20th century. The city preserved the hotel's exterior but quietly approved the remodeling of several interior wings, including the 6th floor. No plaques were hung. No stories were written into brochures. But among the people who had followed the details, there was a quiet agreement that the truth did not need ceremony. It only needed memory. Every October, on the date of her disappearance, Claire's name trended briefly in certain circles. Some lit candles. Some posted excerpts from her journal. Some whispered thanks without explaining why. Her story had not become legend because of mystery. It had become meaningful because it proved that even quiet people who walk alone with questions can leave behind echoes that do not fade. If this story held your attention, take a moment to like and subscribe for more narrative investigations, just like it. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think really happened to Claire? And where are you watching from today?